Putting his fears, his regrets, and guilt behind him, Angelo stood calmly at the entrance of what he assumed to be the next section of the academy. His inventory was now full of, well, many things that he questioned. He had assumed he'd have time to sell the last bit of it. Now it seemed he would have to wait. He had much more serious things to deal with. Slipping his potions onto his belt for easier access and bracing himself, he measured his current mystical ability that remained and, with a slow breath, drifted into the shadow to the side. The corridor before him was empty, but the door at the end most likely was not going to be so lucky. He doubted the mage intended to give up so easily. Carefully, he pushed the door open. And inside were numerous goblins, and he was spotted immediately. He knew he had to hold himself at the door against such numbers. And this stupid door is getting in my way of clicking. Hopefully that'll work out. As he was swarmed, he cut them down one after another. Goblins were no major threat. However, two held much more muscle mass than the rest. Clearly nowhere near as experienced as he, but much more than the other goblins. They were able to avoid many of his attacks, just barely, allowing them to mitigate the damage he dealt to them. They even managed to land a few blows on him. Thankfully, his thick hide was able to easily sway off the small blades. With one down and only one remaining, he had to ponder on the fact of the mage himself, who was nowhere to be seen and had teleported away quickly after the battle had initiated. His words had been simple, that he would die here, that there was nothing that he could do to stop them. But Angelo had to question that. After all, the men had fled. Scooping up the arrows that were on the bodies of the goblins, he carefully paced himself to redraw his crossbow once more. Once again, trying to shift into the shadows, he gave it a moment. The mage had summoned 2 extra goblins in that were waiting, clearly trying to see if the goblins that had rushed him would manage to kill him out of their sight. Taking a moment before lining up his shot and firing. With one down, the last would be easy to deal with. A single swipe of his saber ended the creature's life. But what troubled him was the fact that that mage had not sustained any of the damage he had dealt to him just a few moments earlier. This meant that the mage either also had access to healing spells and held divine power of some sort, or there were multiple mages. Potions couldn't heal clothing, and he was certain he'd sliced through it when he'd impaled the man. Moving towards the chest, Angelo realized how short on time he likely was if there was more than one mage. Cracking it open, he resigned to take what he could and drop what he didn't need here and now. Inside, however, was a surprise. As he opened the chest, he was amazed at what lay inside. Graduation gifts for the highest and second highest scored students. The letter inside was written for himself and another he didn't recognize. Without hesitation, he grabbed the enchanted rings and the boots. It was likely that the students in question were dead anyway. Still, glancing over the letter, he was surprised. After all, it was listed for him. The boots were basic enchanted, designed by mages and fairly common to help enhance reaction time and reflexes. The first ring was a powerful ring of resistance. The concept designed by a Turnish noble, if he recalled. A potent ring that enhanced endurance and reaction time both, as well as granting limited light and even helping to resist different spells that would hinder one's mind. The second ring, likely designed for the second most high-scored individual, was much less elaborate. Still, it had its uses. The Ring of Fortitude, made by the Deadline Shamans to help their people survive the rather harsh environments that they faced. The enchantments were more than welcome. Anything that would help give him an edge was going to be key. Slipping both onto his fingers, as well as, of course, the boots, Angelo would quickly remove the books that he had gathered, as well as any other more needless items in his inventory. He had no time for traps in this scenario. Less weighed down and enhanced with superior equipment, he quickly jogged to the next section, keeping his eyes and ears keen for the next scene. He doubted that a couple of goblins at the entryway was all he would have to face. Cracking open the chest and grabbing the potions within quickly, he slid them onto his belt and prepared for the next section. If he had experiences to go by, he would say that the next room was going to be just as full of the goblins. Carefully pushing it open, his back pressed to the wall on the side, Angelo was surprised, nearly stunned in fact, to see a young, familiar face. Pavel, the naive farm boy. Morningstar bloody and shield battered, looking hopelessly lost and confused. But Angelo's jaw set, because the boy's idiot brother was nowhere in sight. Angelo knew all too well what that meant. As insane and questionable as the other boy had been, he certainly hadn't deserved death. However, he was at an impasse. He was certain Pavel would request to come with him. However, Angelo had just dealt with the immediate threats behind him. As long as Pavel remained in here, with the few goblins that it appeared he had cut down himself, the boy was likely safer here than charging forward at his side. There was no way he could watch over the boy as well. Still, he needed to talk to him at the very least. Maybe try to reassure him and tell him to stay put. Thank the gods you're here, Angelo. I thought the goblins were going to be the death of me. It's me, Pavel, remember? This whole place is crawling with enemies. They killed my brother, Bim. Please, Angelo, you have to let me join up with you. Angelo, having anticipated this, would release a sigh, because there was no point to such things. Instead, he would carefully raise a hand and tell the boy that he had to calm down. There was no point in trying to drag him along, and honestly, he would just get in the way. I'm going to skip through this because it would have no point in any conversation Angelo would have with him. Alright, here we go. I'm not asking you to pay me anything. I just want to join up with you so I can avenge Bim's death and maybe get out of here alive. Angelo, however, would shake his head. He wasn't interested. Not because the boy needed to be paid or because he was not something that could be of use, but simply because Angelo didn't want to use him. The boy was... well, I just reset that. Give me a moment. There we go. The boy simply was too inexperienced. Angelo didn't want to see him die. Enough of that had happened already. The boy was not pleased, of course, telling him that he was thanking him for nothing. I apologize, guys. I'm a little sick. That's why there haven't been videos. Trying to hang in there. I felt like I was good enough. I think I'll slowly clear up once we get back into the swing of things. In any case, though the boy was angry, Angelo felt he had made the right decision. Here he would be safest, though it would be better if he would go into a corner and hide. More books as he glanced over the shelves and checked the book piles. Nothing of use. Not that he could at least dignify weighing himself down right now. Ignoring such things and hoping the boy would grow some common sense and go hide in a corner, Angelo had to move forward. Once more, staying at the entrance of the doorway, prepared for the worst, he would slide the door open. And on cue, he is attacked. Thankfully, with the narrow outlook, the goblins and now skeletons were limited in what they could reach him. Skeletons were a ghastly thing to deal with, but nowhere near as bad as zombies. They should be fairly easy to deal with, even with his saber, which was not designed for dealing with such creatures. He could only hope that he would get his enchanted inventory back. That would greatly assist him in dealing with them. He had his club, however, it was not nearly as effective as his blade in his hands. If he faced a room of skeletons, perhaps. Until then, there was no point. With only a couple left, Angelo would hope that any around the corner did not hear him, at least not immediately, and he would have time. Unfortunately, luck was not with him. Thankfully, with his speed and reflexes as well as his thick hide, these weak ones could not do much damage to him. Still, dodging multiple attacks at once was never a place that anyone wanted to be. Quickly cutting down the goblins, and with a bit of difficulty breaking down the skeletons to follow, Angelo released a breath and quickly gathered anything of use from the bodies. A few copper coins that would eventually add up to some gold once he got to a merchant. The following attacks were much the same. It seemed the mage at the very least only had the skill to make basic skeletons from the bodies of the dead students and staff. Though a few were armed, most of them were just simply that. Loose skeletons bound together by weak magic and standard goblins barely worth his time. Still, he couldn't underestimate them, and large swathes, any group of enemies could be a life-threatening experience. But he still had to move quickly. The creatures were still under threat, and he wasn't sure how long he truly had. Shifting to the shadows once more, he noticed the layout of the hall. This room was likely a center room, and though he was in a hurry, it was likely that there was some degree of treasure inside that may be of use in helping to deal with the threat. Pushing the door open, it was nearly impossible to make it silent, and this was proven. Inside was another swath of skeletons and goblins. However, there was a much greater threat inside. He knew the armor, a goblin elite, a captain equivalent. Still, the fool was behind his servants. If he could cut down the other little ones first, it would make dealing with him much more easy. Every time he felt the axe dig into his flesh and bounce off it, he was thankful for his heritage. Initially, he may have regretted it, but in times like this, it certainly came in handy. And I am not getting very good rolls here. Shouldn't have an issue. There we go. As the skeleton went down, he knew he had a short amount of time before the goblin elite would sneak in on him and begin actually attacking him with much more force. He had to cut down the little ones and finish them off. Getting a lucky swipe in and slitting the throat of the last, he was able to face the final goblin one-on-one. Armed with a shield and basic armor, it would be much more difficult to deal with him. This was proven, as his attacks were rapidly deflected. Thankfully, he still managed to nick him occasionally, and even when the axe bit into him, it was rare that it managed to draw blood. In the end, a goblin was still a goblin, and his thick hide had swayed off much more harsh attacks than creatures of this level. Still, on occasion, the goblin did manage to hit him hard enough to actually draw blood, and those wounds were steadily racking up. I'm really getting bad rolls here. What was that? A 6. There we go. And if any of these fights, because of the game's nature, gets too long, I might edit it out. There we go. With a final swipe of his blade, Angelo managed a lucky hit once more. The fool had lowered his shield, and that meant he had gotten a clear shot into his throat.